We have been spending a lot of time tonight talking about this Wednesday's presidential debate between the Republican candidates for the nomination, except for one. And I want to make sure that you don't miss Salem's coverage of that debate, including yours truly live on the ground in Milwaukee. There's a lot going on, and we got you covered. And one thing I'm really hoping for from this debate, a very serious and robust discussion of the top national security issue this nation faces, and that is the China dilemma. Joining us right now is a man who every single one of these candidates should be talking to and getting briefed by. He is Gordon Chang. Follow him on Twitter, Gordon G. Chang. First of all, Gordon, are the candidates talking to you? Have you heard from? You don't have to name names, but I'm hoping that they're picking your brain.
No, they're not, Larry, but they know what I have to say about it because we're very clear. So I'm not surprised. I mean, especially at an early stage right now.
I suppose. It is curious, though. Well, this weekend, it was a big, and by the way, you're an expert on the entire Pacific Rim and our national security and diplomatic efforts with all of Asia. So I'm interested in your reaction to this Camp David summit. I don't know where it came from, where we have peace in our time, finally, between South Korea and Japan. I didn't realize there were such hostilities between those two nations. What was this all about?
Well, first of all, I think it was about China because China is driving both South Korea and Japan together. Japan, at the beginning of the 20th century, actually not only colonized Korea, but obliterated the Korean nation. Yeah. And Koreans haven't forgotten that. Whether one is a progressive or a conservative, Koreans have seen Japan almost as the enemy, even though Japan is important to the defense of South Korea. So Yoon Suk-yeol, the new conservative president of South Korea, to great political risk to himself, has reached out to Japan, and that has really been important. He's been a statesman, and I think that has largely driven this. President Biden, who believes in alliances, certainly has tried to knit together our friends in the region. And so really what we have is China has actually driven old adversaries together.
And it's certainly the history of the Japanese atrocities, you're right, from the beginning of the 20th century all through World War II and the horrific treatment of the so-called comfort women. Just horrible, horrible history. But setting those animosities aside, and they're decades old, they've had diplomatic ties. They have had economic ties, these two countries, haven't they?
Yes, they have. You know, the United States and Japan are military allies. We have an obligation to defend each other. We have a similar relationship with South Korea, a treaty. But South Korea and Japan are not allies.
I see.
And over the course of decades, the United States has tried to change what's called a hub and spoke relationship into something more of a web to get Japan and South Korea to cooperate. And we haven't been extremely successful in that regard, except what's happened is, first of all, the North Koreans and the Chinese are scaring South Korea, but also Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which the Japanese see as Chinese fueled, that has gotten the Japanese to spend a lot more on their defense. So really, it has been a process that's been driven by Beijing. And what the United States has done is facilitated that with that Camp David meeting, which really was historic in so many different ways.
So, Gordon, does this mean that we're looking at potentially a military alliance that would almost act as a mini Asian NATO should China make military aggressive overtures toward Taiwan? In other words, you invade Taiwan, that means Korea, Japan, the U.S. all work together.
First of all, I don't think Japan and South Korea will ever form a formal military alliance with obligations to defend each other. But they are working much more closely together. And there were 3 documents that came out of that Camp David meeting. What's going to happen, I think, Japan is going to defend Taiwan for a lot of reasons. South Korea probably won't. But that's almost academic, Larry. Because
can I jump in? Is that because of the alliance between North Korea and China, and that their existential threat is so close across the 38th parallel?
Yeah, we forget that China and North Korea are each other's only military ally. I because China will lean on North Korea to invade Japan
Right.
or South Korea. So when things go bad over Taiwan, I think the whole region is plunged into war for various reasons. And it's not just the Chinese and North Koreans, it's also the Russians. The Russians will get involved as well. And so it will be a big fight to the finish in East Asia.
So, speaking of China and Russia and their newfound brotherhood, which, geez, thanks a lot, guys. One thing we had going for us is that both China and Russia were sort of had some animosity. Now they seem to be pals. Their interest lies well beyond their borders like Ukraine and Taiwan. What is their interest in the southern African nations right now during this, what's it called, the BRICS summit?
Yeah, the BRICS is a grouping of countries that are from the global south, one could say. And they really have very little in common, except that a Goldman Sachs analyst a long time ago put together the four countries, BRIC, and South Africa has joined. So that's Brazil, Russia, India, and China, and now South Africa. They're having a summit. It comes at a very interesting time because Putin will not be there in person for, I think, a number of reasons. Xi Jinping is going to South Africa, but he's presiding over a country that's falling apart internally. So I don't think that he'll be the force that he normally would be. And what's going to be interesting will be the India-China meeting between Prime Minister Modi and Xi Jinping, because I think China needs to cool down relationships with India because he's fighting a multi-front war. And I think he probably wants to get the Indians off his back for a little while.
For the American interests, in terms of our economic issues, everyone says that what's really driving our lack of seriousness toward the threat of China is our dependence on them for cheap manufacturing, et cetera. Is India the solution there? Is India the real rising global giant potentially there in terms of accommodating America's manufacturing and economic needs if, in fact, we turn it off with China?
Potentially. Brazil is a country that has always had a lot of potential but not realized it. India under Prime Minister Modi is actually making some progress in terms of becoming a good friend of the West. But there's also been some backsliding as well, and that's over the war in Ukraine. What's happening right now with regard to U.S. supply chains in China is that Xi Jinping has been pushing foreign companies out of China. It's not so much that we're dependent on them that has affected our policy. It's really Xi Jinping has been driving this process. And while Biden has been dog whistling American companies to stay in China, they're just not doing it.
Gordon, back to the BRICS summit here, because it appears as though, and I think it's fascinating, I didn't know the origins here was Goldman Sachs figuring out that Brazil, Russia, India, South Africa, and China could be some sort of alliance. We now have 20 other countries asking to join that alliance, all separate from the United States. Of course, the United States is usually the driving factor in the G7, G10, G20, what have you, as well as NATO military alliance. Is this potentially a real rising threat to U.S. economic dominance by cobbling these countries together and them setting their own agendas outside of the U.S.'s influence?
I don't think so. And the reason is that if you look at the 5 BRICS countries right now, China wants to break apart India. Russia is a pariah. China's falling apart. Brazil is sort of like a bystander to watching all of this. They still need the U.S. market. That is really driving things. And if you look at just the world in general, the United States, for all our troubles, is becoming relatively stronger. And so this is, I think, in a sense, a good story for the U.S. It's just that right now we have leadership that is not recognizing the situation in the world. But the U.S. could be even a greater force for good, and also a much stronger country with different leadership. But even with Biden, we're relatively doing okay.
Huh. All right, Gordon Chang. Follow him on Twitter, Gordon G. Chang. And Gordon, let's hope Wednesday night at the debate we have at least one question that delves into any of the issues we've just covered in the last 10 minutes. Sadly, I don't have high hopes, but hopefully. Thank you, Gordon. There's more to come on O'Connor tonight.